Hey guys! Today I'd like to tell you about how I teach vocab to my students to show you how you can do it effectively. Before recording this video, I watched some videos from other teachers and creators, and there were a lot of good pieces of advice. But one thing that I noticed is that there's just a bunch of different ideas, and I understand that that can get really overwhelming. So you'll be like, oh, I can do this and this and this. But then you'll end up doing either nothing or just things randomly. So like, for example, I watched this one video and the guy's like, you gotta practice the vocab you study over time. Good. And then he's like, well, you can read it, you can blah, blah, blah. Well, reading is not good. Reading is not actually helping you learn. Or then he's like, oh, just pick one word and spend 30 minutes or an hour just thinking about that word. Well, how many words are you gonna end up knowing? Obviously, quality should come first. Quality over quantity. But it's not sustainable to just every so often dedicate an hour a day to a specific word or phrase. So, in today's video, I'd like to show you what I do with my students in my one-on-one lessons so you kind of get an idea of how you can organize your studies such that you learn English vocab better. So the first thing that I do with my students is we get the vocab somewhere. First of all, we don't approach vocab as words. We look at them as chunks. So I have a video on chunks, why that matters, why they're better. But the simple explanation is this. It's easier to use something if you know how to use it. And when you learn chunks, you basically learn combination of words. Because the way we connect words in English may be different from the way you connect the words in your language. Like, for example, why do we do homework and not make homework? Well, there is no good reason. That's just how we say it. So that's an example of chunk. A chunk is any combination of words, like words that are often used together. It's as simple as that. So with my students, the first step to learn new words is to get them from somewhere. When I teach my students, we do a lot of different things. We work on different skills: reading, writing, listening, speaking, of course. We work on vocab, grammar, and pronunciation. So whenever we're working on something, we can pull useful chunks. So that can be completely new vocab that they've never heard before, never seen before, and have no idea what it means. Or it can be something that they can recognize. For example, they're reading, they sort of understand it. Then I can take the text, or if it's a video, like the script, and I cover certain words. And I see, can they figure out what should be there? I could cover some prepositions and see if they know how to say that. And if they don't, or they're not sure, then we can take that chunk. They can also hear some things like in movies or at work if they speak English at work. And they're like, oh, that's a good phrase, I gotta use it. So we take all these chunks and we work with them in a variety of ways. So step one is, in class, I make sure that they sort of have an idea of what they mean. And then sometimes I can create more practice right then and there, or sometimes we directly move on to the next step. The next step is for my students to work at home on those chunks. So they do several things. The first thing is they research any chunks that they're not sure about. So that may mean, like, they don't know, can we use this chunk to talk about people or just things? Like, for example, let's say to prioritize something over something. Can we prioritize someone over someone? Like, can we say that we prioritize a person over something? So they figure all those things out if they don't know that yet. If they do, they write down those words on a special online chunks board that each of my students has, and they create their own examples. So sometimes what this means is they need to do extra research and look at a lot of examples. Sometimes they realize, okay, this chunk is great, but I don't really know what the preposition after it should be. So they might expand a chunk, or they might be like, you know what, this is a great phrase, but what other verbs can I use it with? So they do that. They figure out what collocates with the chunk, like what verb, for example, or can we add, let's say, an adjective in the middle of it? So my students do this research, then they create their own examples. Usually 1 or 2 examples, that depends. Like if it's a simple chunk and they just have like a little bit of a struggle with the preposition, then they don't need a bunch of examples. But if it's something more complicated, then maybe it's a good thing to add more. So usually it's 1 or 2 examples per chunk. Then we check those in class. Sometimes everything is great and maybe I just make a few small corrections. But sometimes I see that they don't really understand what this chunk means. For example, one of my students just learned the phrase, the chunk, to be located on the outskirts of something. And she was talking about how, I forget, like a house is on the outskirts of the neighborhood, and that's not really a natural way to use it. We tend to use this chunk to talk about something like on the outskirts of a city. That would be the most common way to use it. So I make sure my student knows these things. Once that's done, I create different opportunities for my student to practice those chunks. So the way that can be done is, there's a lot of ways. I create quizzes. For example, we play a game online where they have to, let's say I leave a gap. So I create a sentence and I leave a gap, and their job is, based on the context, to figure out what chunk is missing. And I can adjust that a little bit. Sometimes if it's like a lot of words, I can indicate how many words are missing. Or sometimes I can show them the first letter of the first word. So I adjust it based on the difficulty of the chunk. Also, when we practice other skills, I can include those chunks in there. So for example, we were working on some grammar and my student has to do certain exercises for that piece of grammar. I, let's say, create like an exercise where those chunks are used. So here we're not focusing on them, but they're exposed to them again and again and again. In addition, of course, there's always a bunch of opportunities for my students to practice in speaking and in writing, because that's how they actually produce the language that they learn. Like people say things like, oh, I gotta speak in order to improve my speaking. Yes, that's one of the things you need to do. Same here. It's a necessary step, not the only one. So one of the things I can do, and you can do that too with ChatGPT, is sometimes, let's say I can cover some of the chunks so you can see some of them. I literally just kind of draw over them. So you can see a little bit, but not everything. And the idea is that in order to get those chunks, my students really need to try and remember them because they can only see bits and pieces of them. And what I can do is create a question that nudges them to use that chunk in the answer. So for example, let's say I know that my student lives somewhere like not in the center of the city, and I cover up the chunks and I highlight the chunk I want, let's say on the outskirts of a city, and I ask her something like, so where is your house? Where do you live? And then she's prompted to answer using that chunk. Or let's say the chunk is to look up to somebody, like to consider them, let's say to admire a person, to look up to someone. So my student will have by now written down that chunk on the board and will have created some examples. They by now know that it's a phrasal verb, it's a transitive phrasal verb, which means that it needs an object. Who do you look up to? You can't just say, I look up to. You need to say, who? Who do you look up to? And they also know that it's inseparable because it has up and to. When a phrasal verb has 2 or more particles, it's inseparable, which means you can't put that object in the middle. You can't separate the 3 words, look, up, and to. So in order to kind of prompt my student to use that chunk in a question, I can ask them to tell me about their role model. And we do that with all the chunks, all the new chunks that we've been working on lately. So let's say it could be 5 or 10 chunks. At some point, it can be now, or it can be done immediately after my students have added the chunks to the board and created examples, and I've checked those examples, that my students create flashcards. There's a lot of ways to do that. I've been working actually on a course for English learners about flashcards, how to use them effectively. But the basic idea is this. You need to create space between study sessions, which means you learn something today, you practice it tomorrow, then in 2 days, then in 3 days, then in 5 days, 7 days. The space needs to increase over time. Flashcards allow you to do that. And the basic idea behind flashcards is to help you retrieve that information. In the beginning, I mentioned that reading is useless, and I don't mean reading for like improving your reading skills. I mean, if you want to remember something, just rereading it is a waste of your time. What you want is to create some effortful way to pull that chunk out of your memory. That can be done through quizzes, it can be done through writing when you have to remember it and you don't have the specific chunk like right in front of you. So what it basically means if you're using flashcards is you write the question, I don't know, it can be a translation if you want, but like it's not a translation that is word by word. It needs to sound natural both in your language and in English, even though the words might not be exactly the same if you translated word by word. So it could be a translation on one side, you look at it, you try to remember the answer. Only after that you can look at the answer. That is a great example of retrieval practice. So my students have a schedule, and while we're doing stuff in class where I create a bunch of opportunities for them to practice in writing and speaking, they also do that in their homework, like we're writing an essay, and I try, for example, to pull together a lot of things that we've studied, different things, not just vocab, but vocab is part of that. So for example, I can have them write an essay and let's say pay a special attention to let's say topic sentences. Maybe that's what we've studied. And maybe we studied passive, so I want them to use that and include those chunks. So all of those things are happening in class and as part of their homework, but they're always also responsible for practicing with their flashcards. In the beginning, I teach my students to use flashcards in a really good, effective and efficient way. And so over time, that's their responsibility. And that is mostly it. Obviously, there is a billion things you can do with vocab. You can do a lot of writing, a lot of different kinds of speaking, but the main thing is this. You need a certain routine. A routine that follows what we know, like the evidence-based methods. So here, I need you to have a routine that will help you study more efficiently. Because if you have a bunch of things to do, you will be like, do I do this or this or this? Pick a routine. What I offered you here, obviously, if you have a teacher, it's going to be easier, but there's a lot of this that you can do with the help of like dictionaries and ChatGPT if you're trying to study on your own. So create a routine. You can sometimes do other things for your vocab. Obviously, it's a great idea to pick something up when you're listening to a podcast. It's great, but it's part of the puzzle. What you need to understand is that, for example, listening to something and picking it up is not going to enable you to use that vocab in your speaking. That's just not enough. So you need to create opportunities for yourself to struggle, and it's best if you have a routine. Add space between the study sessions. You don't want to practice the same vocab in like the same way and let's say every day. No, that does not make sense. That's not how memory works. You want to study today, you want to study tomorrow, then in a few days, then keep increasing the gaps between the study sessions. That's really important. And don't just reread the words. That's not going to help you. Writing example sentences is a great idea. But if you sometimes write example sentences, sometimes you don't, or let's say you take 100 words and you try to write example sentences, are you going to remember them? No. Quality over quantity. So the third point is create opportunities for yourself to practice and to retrieve, not reread, and tie all of this together. So to recap, the things you need to do. First, you need to focus on creating a sustainable routine, something you do all the time. Think about going to the gym. When a person goes to the gym and wants to, let's say, improve specific muscles, and they do just everything, and at random times, that's not going to help them achieve their goal. So if you want to improve your vocab, you need to dedicate time to working on your vocab. So create a routine that works. Create space between study sessions and increase that space every time. So for example, start working with some new vocab today, then practice it more tomorrow, then in 3 days, then in 5 days, and keep on doing that. And the third point, don't just reread stuff. Make sure you're practicing in an active way. It can be through writing examples at some point of your routine. It can be through speaking and writing closer to, like, after, of course, you've figured out how to actually use it, you've heard it, you know you can pronounce it correctly and all that stuff. that's when you can start and should start writing and speaking with it. I don't necessarily recommend you things like, oh, just think about it for an hour. I mean, that's not sustainable. Is it useful in the moment? Yes, but can you do that with every phrase all the time? No, that's not sustainable. So that's that. And also, of course, use flashcards. Incorporate flashcards into your routine because it's easy to do that and it's extremely effective because it helps you create a routine. It allows you to use spaced repetition, which is when you add spaces in between your study sessions. And it's active retrieval if you use them correctly. If you don't just read the answer, but try to answer the whatever you want to remember. So again, look at it, say the answer, then look at the back, look at the answer. Only like that. So yeah, I really hope that this helps, that these ideas that I've given you in this video can help you to build a more efficient routine and allow you to practice English in a more effective way. I've noticed in my one-on-one lessons that people really tend to have no idea on how to use flashcards efficiently. So I've been working on a course about that for the last 2 years. So make sure to get on my newsletter if you want to be among the first people to learn that my course is ready. I expect it to be ready in a few months, maybe. And I know it's gonna blow your mind. Anyways, I hope this helps and I'll see you. Bye-bye. There's something I forgot to mention. I know that it's a lot more effective and efficient to study with a teacher, but I also understand that it's not really possible for everybody. If you feel like you need sort of more step-by-step instructions on how to study English vocab, I put together a checklist that you can get right now for free by using the link in the description to this video. I hope it helps, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can leave a comment here or you can email me. I'll be happy to help.